Just yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office released their long-term budget outlook. This was certainly sobering reading. They pointed out that under the alternative fiscal scenario in 2024, interest costs, Social Security, and major health spending would exceed all of the revenue coming in to the government. The need for action is clear. Congressional Budget Office states that these levels of debt will cause incomes to be between 7% and 18% lower in 2035 than they would be otherwise. Another study by economists Reinhardt and Rogoff found that countries with a debt to GDP level that is greater than 90%, and I would emphasize, Mr. President, that we are currently at 95%, but that countries with a debt to GDP level greater than 90% grow at 1 percentage point less than they would otherwise. In other words, when you're carrying this kind of a debt load, 90% debt to GDP for a sustained period of time, you're bleeding about 1% of economic growth every single year. And as we know from the President's own economic advisors, a 1% reduction, 1% drop in growth translates into about 1 million lost jobs.
The average unemployment now is 40 weeks. So that's about 9 months. 9 months. So it's 9 months of stress, 9 months of uncertainty, 9 months of wondering how to make ends meet. This is, I'm told, the worst statistic in terms of length of being unemployed that we've had since the records were kept. So it is not just about these terrible unemployment numbers. It's a fact that when you've been out that long, you lose some of your job skills, you have a gap in your resume, it's harder to get a job. And this is not what was promised, by the way. If you look at what the President and his economists promised when the stimulus was passed, they said that unemployment today would be about 6.7%. Instead, it's over 9%, 9.1%. So it hasn't worked. The President has called it a bump in the road. I unfortunately think it's a lot more than that. On the spending side, this chart's interesting because it shows federal spending as a percent of the economy, which, as we all know, has gone up significantly, and part of that is because of the stimulus package and then the unemployment rate. And unfortunately, when you look at this, there has not been an increase in spending and a decrease in unemployment. There's been an increase in spending and an increase in unemployment. So I think, you know, this simple notion that you can't spend your way to prosperity, which is a common sense notion that most Americans agree with, has been proven to be true. Unfortunately, the stimulus package did not lead to the kind of progress the President and his team predicted, and you know, we're all paying the price for it.
Unfortunately, the evidence overwhelmingly points to the President and his policies making this situation worse and much worse. For example, as you mentioned, non-defense discretionary spending, which is the part of the spending that the President has to sign into law every year, went up 24% since he took office, which is an astounding amount, particularly when you consider the fact that inflation at that time, over that time period, was about 2%. So government spending was growing at about 10 times the rate of inflation. And in fact, the proposed fiscal year 2012 budget would spend, this was the President's proposal, would spend $46 trillion over the 10-year time period, add $9.47 trillion to the debt, and raise taxes by $1.6 trillion. So their prescription continues to be more spending, more borrowing, and higher taxes.
To your point about the impact of this debt and deficit on the job front, you're absolutely right, and this poll you talked about where 65% of Americans think that the debt and deficit is a major factor in the high unemployment, they're right. The study you talked about said that if the debt gets past 90% of our economy, it's estimated to cost about 1 million jobs. My hope is that this Senate can vote on sensible regulatory reform, and soon.
Frankly, I think most Americans believe, and I believe they are right, that this is overwhelmingly a spending issue. If you look at our 40-year average for spending up until 2008, it was about 20.6% of our GDP. And Obama's budget would have us spend about 24.3% of GDP. And so if you look at what we need to, where we need to focus on, I would say to my colleague from Ohio, it is clearly in the area of getting spending and debt under control and dealing with that issue as opposed to the issue of revenue.